The New Woman and the Woman's Exponent, an editorial perspective. An article by Carol Cornwall Madsen, published in BYU Studies Quarterly, Volume 59, Issue 3. In general, the Victorians valued women who were fragile, dependent on men, shielded from life's difficulties, and motherly. Aside from its advocacy for strong mothers, this ideal was never promoted in the Woman's Exponent, a newspaper written by and addressed to Latter-day Saint women from 1872 to 1914. Rather, the ideal woman the paper praised was educated, independent, and capable in the public sphere as well as the home, much like the New Woman of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Carol Cornwall Madsen's article explains how this periodical helped the women of the church be informed supporters of plural marriage and women's suffrage.
The Woman's Exponent will furnish good material for future historians who will, it is ardently hoped, remember the women of Zion when compiling the history of this Western land. There has been no great work during these years commenced by women that has not been considered and helped by this little paper. Economically, politically, socially, and theologically, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were known for being insular and cohesive at a time when the United States was stretching its boundaries and developing unifying communication and transportation networks across the continent. The concept of manifest destiny was imbibed by the young republic, and rugged individualism became a symbol of the adventurous entrepreneurs who saw a bounteous future in the great American West, especially with the addition of Mexican territory in 1848 and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. The church was clearly out of sync with the path the nation followed, instead wrapping itself in the encircling wagons of distance and cohesion that promised security and sanctuary against the barbs and threats and abuse by those who drove them to the western frontier of the United States and then followed them there. But when polygamy was introduced in 1852 as another peculiar Mormon practice, the limits of religious, social, and political tolerance were reached. Polygamy was an affront to Victorian sensibilities, irrespective of its religious foundation, and every effort was exerted to stamp it out. Several Congressional Anti-Polygamy Acts, a U.S. Supreme Court decision declaring polygamy unconstitutional, and nearly 30 years of effort were required, however, to force the Church to capitulate. In 1890, Church President Wilford Woodruff issued a manifesto, suspending the practice of plural marriage, and with it went a primary obstacle to statehood, which 7 attempts and nearly half a century had failed to achieve. When statehood was granted in 1896, Utah, in many respects, joined the mainstream of American life. LDS women gain an advocate. Against this well-known background of Utah history, the Woman's Exponent emerged in 1872 to speak for Mormon women who were often the target of anti-polygamy diatribes. Several factors contributed to the birth of this semi-monthly journal for LDS women. Prior to the June publication of the Women's Exponent's first issue, the newly founded Salt Lake Herald, whose editor, Edward L. Sloan, had originated the idea of a women's paper, announced that women of Utah are today unquestionably more the subject of comment than those of any other portion of the country, or indeed of the world. As they have long exercised the right to think and act for themselves, so they claim the right to speak for themselves through the potent mediums of the type. A second salient reason was Sloane's confidence that the women of Utah could write and defend themselves against the clamor of disparagement that surrounded them on all sides. In January 1870, at the same time Sloane was laying plans for the Women's Exponent, LDS women met in the Old Tabernacle in Salt Lake City to protest the particularly punitive Anti-Polygamy Column Bill then being debated in Congress. Women conducted the meeting, and 14 members of the large, exclusively female assemblage spoke on behalf of plural marriage. The rally brought them many accolades for their logic and rhetoric, not only from local papers but also from New York papers. The Utah legislature, comprised of male members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was so convincingly swayed by the words and manners of these women that a month later it decided, with little opposition, to grant them the right to vote. Though women's enfranchisement would add strength to the political dominance of Latter-day Saints in the territory, it also ignited in many of the lawmakers a latent sense of the injustice of denying women the vote. Utah's enfranchisement of women was certainly one of the factors that convinced Edward Sloane that the women of the church were capable of maintaining a paper of their own. Though the paper would be managed and written by women, Sloane was putting the paper in the tradition of church publications from its founding, such as the Times and Seasons, Millennial Star, and numerous religious pamphlets designed to tell the Mormon story. The Women's Exponent would be the means of telling the LDS women's story. Sloane would also be numbered among those men across the country who selected women to become editors of the newspapers or magazines they founded. Two of the most popular early 19th century publications were The Ladies' Magazine and Godey's Ladies' Book, both of which were founded by Louise A. Godey and edited by Sarah Josepha Hale. In 1870, when Sloane, a longtime journalist, and his partner William C. Dunbar founded and edited the Salt Lake Herald, Sloane was interested in running a woman's column in the newspaper. Dunbar rejected the idea, which led Sloane to found a separate paper for women, the Woman's Exponent. As an editor, Sloane was aware of the growing popularity of women's magazines and newspapers. Following the Civil War, many of them were political in nature, seeing the denial of women's vote as parallel to the suppression of voting rights of the newly emancipated slave population. Sloane, however, eschewed the idea of entering the national debate on women's rights, just as Godey disdained the discussion of slavery in his magazines. As Sarah Hale had declared in 1841, the popular Godey's Ladies' Book would not deal with politics or theology because, she announced, other subjects are more important for our sex and more proper for our sphere. Her publication was a strong element in both defining and promoting the then-current home-centered definition of womanhood and woman's sphere, attracting thousands of devoted followers of its fashion plates and feminine approach. It rejected any signs of changing traditional social practices other than extending more educational opportunities for women and encouraging women to utilize them. But Sloane did believe that his new paper would be a timely move, allowing LDS women to counteract, in their own words, some of the derogatory descriptions of LDS women appearing in other publications. The women's rights movement slowly encroached on the preeminence of the traditional image of womanhood, leading to a number of publications by women, fostering a wider public arena for women. At its founding in 1872, the Women's Exponent almost inadvertently joined a large coterie of women's rights journals and papers. In the first issue, Louisa Green, its first editor, from 1872 to 1877, outlined its editorial dimensions, which were slightly broader than Sarah Hale's mission statements. It was to be a journal of LDS women's thoughts, a forum for their opinions, and a record of their work. She absolved the paper from any need to advocate women's suffrage, since Utah women had been voting for 2 years, to contend against wrongs perpetrated by the male half of the community, or to champion any special claims. We have no rivalry with any, no war to wage, no contest to provoke. Yet, in that same editorial, Green promised to speak freely on every topic of current interest to both the women of Utah and women the world over. In order to fulfill the latter promise, however, Green soon found it necessary to advocate the cause of women's suffrage, contend against the discrimination of women in education and employment, and especially the denigration of LDS women, and defend vigorously the Church's practice of plural marriage. These were all issues of interest to her readers and writers, and comprised a third of the journal's editorial content during its 42-year history. The early demise of Sloan, the paper's founder, just 2 years after the Exponent's establishment, left the editors as the final arbiters of the journal's content, and they enthusiastically engaged their paper in the national conversations on women's rights that marked the latter years of the 19th century. After the Herald's announcement of the women's newspaper, the Salt Lake Daily Tribune, a non-LDS newspaper, stated, quote, "What kind of a woman character it will possess we know not, but seeing that the church organs make a considerable display of it, we think it may be like Utah female suffrage, another polygamic institution." End quote. Surprisingly, upon receiving a copy of the first issue of the Exponent, the Tribune conceded that, quote, "Aside from its polygamic leanings, we regard it as the greatest stride the Mormons have yet made in literature, being well edited and quite newsy, and we think it will take well amongst the Mormon ladies, as it is much more modern in style and contains less of priestly cant than most other Mormon publications." End quote. This was an unexpected endorsement of the paper, one particularly aimed at non-Mormon readers. Editing the Women's Exponent. When the paper was formally launched in June 1872, both its name and editor were in place. Louisa Green, a young single woman from Smithfield, Utah, would lead the Women's Exponent into becoming a strong advocate for the growing women's rights movement. Elsewhere, other new publications by women were promoting the emancipation of women, focusing on broadened legal and political rights with varying degrees of success. The Revolution, organ of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and edited by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, lasted only 2 years, from 1868 to 1870, but it laid the groundwork for the long struggle ahead. Most enduring was the Boston Women's Journal, a publication of the American Women's Suffrage Association, running from 1870 to 1919, and a rival to the National Association. Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, 1870 to 1876 of New York, and the New Northwest, 1871 to 1887 of Portland, were both prominent in their time. These periodicals followed the lead set by the Lily, 1849 to 1856, a temperance paper that shifted to women's rights, and the Una, 1853 to 1877, which began as and remained solely a women's rights paper. In addition to these popular papers, the Women's Exponent occasionally published news from the Chicago Balance, the Homestead of Oakland, the Golden Dawn of San Francisco, the News Century, published by the Women's United States Centennial Committee in Philadelphia, the Boston Watchman, and especially Women's Words. Indeed, the editors of the Women's Exponent were joining a large sorority of editors of women's rights papers that reached across the country. While the Exponent enjoyed the church leaders' advocacy and financial help in meeting printing costs, the paper was produced independently, sustained primarily by its subscriptions. It was never an official organ of the Relief Society, though it became a resource for information on the activities of the various units of the Relief Society, as well as those of the Young Ladies MIA and Primary Association throughout the territory. It did not try to replicate either a newspaper or a ladies' magazine, but developed a unique style appropriate to its own purposes. Issued semi-monthly, it had no organized staff or paid employees except for female typesetters and the printers. Its circulation was relatively small, never reaching the goal of 3,000, but its content reflected the opinions of a variety of contributors besides its editors. Its lofty goal was clearly announced in its prospectus. Quote, "The women of Utah today occupy a position which attracts the attention of intelligent-thinking men and women everywhere. They have been grossly misrepresented through the press by active enemies who permit no opportunity to pass of maligning and slandering them, and with but limited opportunity of appealing to the intelligence and candor of their fellow countrymen and countrywomen in reply, who are so well able to speak for the women of Utah as the women of Utah themselves. It is better to represent ourselves than to be misrepresented by others. For these reasons, and that women may help each other by the diffusion of knowledge and information possessed by many and suitable to all, the publication of Women's Exponent, a journal owned by, controlled by, and edited by Utah ladies, has been commenced." End quote. Obtaining sufficient copy for each issue was an unwelcome task. Many of the paper's readers were unresponsive to the issues raised by the paper, either reluctant to see their names in print or indifferent to the crusade for women's rights that seemed peripheral to their own lives. As a result, besides handling the financial accounts and the editing, the layout, and the mailing of each issue, the editors also carried the burden of writing much of the content themselves. At the outset of the new periodical, Louisa Green noted that though circulation had rapidly increased in the first few months, literary contributions were not as forthcoming as expected. "There are numbers of ladies throughout the territory who could write," she noted, "and yet do not, and could clothe in pointed, touching words ideas that would be of great value to their sisters everywhere." When Emmeline Wells became editor, she complained of the daunting task of acquiring sufficient copy and confided to her diary, "I never supposed when I commenced working on the paper that I would have to do everything for myself. I feel sometimes my burden is too heavy." However, as the Exponent was ineluctably drawn into the debate on suffrage, polygamy, and statehood, more copy joined the editor's editorials, and the paper became an influential tool in disseminating information from the active women's rights movement in the East, as well as news of other advancements in women's status elsewhere in the world. In addition to the editor's own contributions and the pieces submitted by a small band of loyal contributors, the Exponent also included reprints from other journals, letters from readers, reports from women-led Latter-day Saint auxiliaries, and the minutes from the bi-monthly meetings of the Independent Retrenchment Association. For $2 per annum, the subscriber could expect 24 bi-monthly issues. This schedule persisted for 17 years. Then, after 1889, publication became erratic, varying from 9 to 22 issues per year for $1. In those hundreds of pages produced during the paper's long run, much of LDS history is written and preserved, including an editorial focus on church policies and events, a growing association with the organization and individual women supporting women's suffrage, and other concerns pertinent to women. It also became a repository of individual women's biographies and autobiographies as Editor Wells sought to fulfill Brigham Young's commission to write brief sketches of the lives of the leading women of Zion and publish them, and to tell the sisters to take the Exponent and keep it, for it will contain the record of their work and a portion of church history. Indeed, it is a great repository of LDS women's history. Wells' efforts to meet Young's request resulted in 200 multi-column life sketches of LDS women and 800 lengthy obituaries. In addition, short stories, mainly by Editor Wells, poetry and commentary on church events and conferences, as well as local events and individuals, appeared alongside reprints of articles from other women's papers. Only 3% of the editorials dealt with household affairs. Readers' letters, tributes to friends and leaders, and minute details of the proceedings of national meetings attended by LDS women also filled the pages of the Exponent. Group biographies of women in various fields of employment, such as journalism, medicine, literature, politics, education, philanthropy, and even farming were included, their stories usually written by the editors. The Women's Exponent recognized women in the wide variety of lives they lived. The Relief Society and Women's Rights. In 1889, another unplanned connection between the Relief Society and the women's rights movement, promoted by Emmeline Wells and the Women's Exponent, gave LDS women an opportunity to recognize the value of the rights they had already obtained, mainly through the Relief Society organized in March 1842 in Nauvoo, Illinois. The ostensible beginning of the national women's rights movement was the convention held in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. In preparation for that meeting, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had written a declaration of sentiments which enumerated the grievances arising from the suppression of women's representation, not only in the realm of politics, but also in all aspects of civil life, particularly education, religion, employment, and the law. Emmeline Wells, in an editorial written 47 years after the organization of the Relief Society, connected that 1842 event with the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention held 6 years later. The organization of the Relief Society, she opined, opened perhaps one of the most important eras in the history of women. It presented the great woman question to the Latter-day Saints, previous to the women's rights organizations, which have created such extensive agitation, since it has given to women opportunities for expressing her own thoughts, views, and opinions, all of which has had a tendency to make her intelligent in regard to matters which before were considered incompatible with women's sphere, and unintelligible to her weaker mind. This ebullient assessment of the benefits of the LDS Women's Relief Society bolstered the self-image of many Latter-day Saint women and measurably counteracted the effects of the mordant barbs of their anti-Mormon detractors. Ardent encouragement from Eliza R. Snow and other Relief Society leaders also helped to bolster the confidence of their Relief Society sisters. Periodic reports from ward relief societies published in the Women's Exponent bear out the reality of Wells' extensive beneficial claims of the progressive nature of the Relief Society. The women's movement was an all-encompassing and even radical movement, supporting not only the right to vote, but also women's right to ownership of their own property upon marriage, educational opportunities on all levels, a wide swath of employment, and independent leadership in their own church auxiliary organizations. Utah was well advanced in granting many of these rights to women, and Wells was not averse to crediting the Relief Society for obtaining those newly confirmed rights. Utah women joined the women's movement. Despite their progressive stance, LDS women activists didn't formally enter the national conversation on equal rights so much as they were inadvertently drawn into it. An issue oft debated by anti-polygamists was the question of how it was possible for women to live in a society that provided numerous civil rights to them, even as that society kept them under the yoke of an outlawed marriage system. The woman's exponent, however, was a great defender of the unrecognized values and opportunities that women in plural marriage possessed, making it a handmaid in the movement for equality. The exponent's response to the constant derogation of the practice and of the women who practiced it focused on women's right to choose their own form of marriage, including plural marriage. Being among the few enfranchised women in the nation, LDS women also recognized that women's suffrage was a means of empowering women in the public sphere. Rather than voting to overturn the practice of plural marriage, however, LDS women voted to maintain a woman's right to choose to become a plural wife. Joining in the most encompassing and intense issues relating to women through its editorials, the Exponent was indeed forced to renege on its original intention to avoid controversial matters. In doing so, the paper clearly showed its advocacy for women and a new image of the 19th century woman. Nearly half, 44.53%, of the editorials over the 42-year span of the Women's Exponent dealt with women's suffrage, plural marriage, or women's rights. Neither editor shied away from wrestling with the vitiation and degradation that characterized the arguments mounted by detractors of Mormonism generally and polygamy specifically, as well as of women's suffrage. In fact, addressing these issues on the Exponent's editorial page gave the Exponent currency, substance, and legitimacy as a resource for women to understand and participate in the events swirling around them. And it clearly made LDS women and the Women's Exponent major components in the national discussion of women's rights. The Exponent published in its first issue an article signed E., certainly an effective pseudonym with all the Elizas, Emmelines, and Elizabeths as possible contenders for authorship. The article argued for equal pay, equal education opportunity, and greater options for employment. This article opened the way for the paper to publish other grievances, both general and personal. It showed an awareness of at least one woman eager to share her thoughts publicly on the concerns voiced in the national movement for women's rights. The papers clearly expressed avoidance of any need to contend or champion or defend was nullified in its first issue, and the Exponent became a major player in the long contention between Mormon and federal officials, particularly over plural marriage. The endorsement by church leaders indicated consent to the women's quest for equality and helped to build name recognition and awareness of the paper and its stance during these early years. With church support and a medium to express their views, LDS women were ready to join the growing movement for women's rights. Plural marriage as a woman's right. The urgency to defend plural marriage against the many anti-polygamy bills appearing in Congress made addressing the issue one of the first departures from the editor's early promise to refrain from contending with critics and defamers. The Church's original religious and constitutional defense of the practice did not match the kind of argument that polygamy's denigrators employed. One focused on the social policies, psychological factors, and familial aspects of the practice. Latter-day Saints were thus obliged to meet the critics on their terms. Emmeline Wells, for example, promoted the idea that plural marriage could prove an antidote to many of the immoral practices of the world, a strong plank in the platform of women's suffrage. Plural marriage, she asserted, was consistent with laws of life and health for both present and future generations, while the other was contrary to morality and chastity. Idealistically, she claimed that plural marriage had at its foundation the strength and building up of family life. It was the worldly way that destroyed the family. Additionally, she believed that polygamy could be the means of eliminating prostitution, since all women would have the opportunity for marriage with good and righteous men. Far from being a bondage and enslavement of women, the exponent argued plural marriage gave women, quote, more time for thought, for mental culture, more freedom of action, a broader field of labor, inculcates liberality and generosity, develops more fully the spiritual elements of life, fosters purity of thought, and gives wider scope to benevolence, end quote. In other words, polygamy, quote, does not narrow, but widens women's field for usefulness, end quote. This idea was bedrock to the editors of the Exponent and to other public defenders of the practice, and to their credit, their unrelenting stance neither impeded the development of personal friendships with their Gentile suffrage cohorts, nor denied them membership in some of the national women's organizations of that time, particularly the National Women's Suffrage Association and the National and International Councils of Women. In all three groups, LDS women had much opportunity to speak, persuade, and defend not only their lifestyle, but also the women's movement in general. Polygamy was a women's issue, they maintained, and very much an element of women's rights. While her defense of the practice was basically constitutional in principle, editor Emmeline Wells capitalized on the personal ramifications of the practice. As an exemplar, she personified the plural wife who developed self-reliance, resilience, and personal independence. These qualities flowed into Wells' ideas of the new woman, a concept then being created through the arguments and political rhetoric of the suffragists and other women's rights activists. Of course, the federal government didn't quite agree with Emmeline's assessment of the good that polygamy might offer, so Wells tried a logical approach and an appeal for the rights of citizens. Quote, would it not be well for the nation to pause ere any irrevocable step is taken that would strike at the peace and happiness and individual liberty of the people of Utah, and examine well and closely into the conditions of the territory? Would it not be wiser to hear both sides of this case before decisive steps are taken to punish? We have always understood every person in the Republic was entitled to a fair hearing before any verdict could be given. End quote. Her citizens' appeal was also unconvincing to the authorities, though she saw precedents being set for possible future consequences resulting from federal intervention in religion. Quote, the sectarian priests who have been loudest in denouncing the Mormons from the pulpit and to the government may tremble for fear of the retribution which is sure to follow upon their devoted heads now that the government has commenced legislating against one form of religion. End quote. Twice a plural wife, Wells believed it should be a legitimate choice for all women. Defending their marriage style brought numerous LDS women into the public sphere. The Women's Exponent gave those women a platform on which those who were fortified enough by their indignation toward the action of the government could rise up and express their dismay. Wells was not intimidated by her opponents and felt the support of her church leaders. It was a frenzied time, however. From 1882 to 1890, when government action was full-blown against polygamy, the 101 Exponent editorials on the practice were primarily directed toward defending the constitutional right to practice it, despite a negative Supreme Court ruling in 1879. They denounced the various legislative acts prohibiting it, enumerating the dire results of their enforcement. National suffrage meetings unified Utah and national suffragists in expressing their opposition to both the Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act of 1882, which, among its provisions, disenfranchised all men and women involved in plural marriage, and the 1887 Edmunds Tucker Act, which removed the right to vote from all Utah women, not just polygamous wives. Before the Edmunds Tucker Act passed in 1887, the Exponent made one of its last comments on the subject. Quote, "Those who live longest will see in the finale of the present controversy and persecution now raging, ostensibly in consequence of the practice of a principle that was taught and practiced by holy men of old, that it will yet appear that office-seeking, political place and power, and mammon were the real motives that caused the raid against the Mormons." End quote. The finale came with the Edmunds Tucker Act of 1887, which attacked the financial holdings of the church, and in 1890, President Wilfred Woodruff issued a manifesto agreeing to suspend the performance of any additional plural marriages. Emmeline Wells wrote her final editorial on the practice. Quote, "This is indeed an interesting period in the history of this people, and those who have been looking for a great change to transpire that Zion might be liberated from bondage ought to take into consideration how often it has been repeated to the saints that the Lord's ways are not man's ways, and that great things never come about as even wise men anticipate. Again and again, in ancient and modern revelation, has the Lord said he would have a tried people, even as gold 7 times purified. Therefore, the saints should not murmur as did ancient Israel, lest they lose sight of the prize of the high calling." End quote. These words were hopeful, but had little effect on the alteration of LDS life after plural marriages were outlawed. However, though LDS women lost the battle over polygamy, they were determined to gain the statutory right to the vote permanently. With statehood on the horizon, the Women's Exponent announced the organization of LDS women into a distinct suffrage organization to be known as the Utah Territorial Women's Suffrage Association. Through the polygamy crusade, women recognized the necessity of the vote in the determination of public policy. The Women's Exponent would be a strong force in support of women's suffrage, now a pressing campaign that was making headway in the West. Those women who had publicly defended their right to choose their own marital pattern had gained the experience to speak and write about the need for and the right of women to vote. Women's suffrage. From the day they first received their right to the ballot in 1870, LDS women were forced into defensive mode. Each new anti-polygamy bill proposed by Congress became more punitive in its methods of enforcement and began rescinding women's right to vote. The Women's Exponent became an essential tool in the debate, explaining the value to the community of the ballot in women's hands. As Wells explained, quote, "Women have not asked for suffrage because of place or power, or to crowd men out of the ranks of the wage earners or professions, but that they may be acknowledged as being an equal in the work and business of the great world in which all must live and take part. This great work can never be done well by one half of the human family. It is the opinion of all who think deeply that men and women must do the work together and unitedly." End quote. Not all LDS women were as eager as suffragists to fight for the vote. Most of those who were against it were non-LDS or disaffected LDS women, and were concerned about the additional political power that enfranchised women would provide to the church. Wells was dismayed at the apathy she detected among many LDS women, and particularly urged foreign-born sisters to seek citizenship, and citizens to acknowledge the precious right and privileges of the ballot. If women could acknowledge the power that the vote would give them, the exponent declared, and come forward in their united strength and help maintain the rights which will secure to them and those they love and their children the homes and the liberty of which in times past they have been so unjustly deprived, they would be a force with which to reckon. Utah suffragists, however, having now lost their right to vote after 17 years of enfranchisement, had to fight to reclaim it. To do so required an organized plan, originated and implemented by the women themselves, which they were capable of doing. Their efforts at lobbying Utah's Constitutional Convention delegates in 1895 by their persuasive arguments were successful, and women's suffrage became part of Utah's organic law when statehood was declared in 1896. It had not been an easy crusade, however. When the Edmunds Tucker Act passed in 1887, it disenfranchised not only the men and women who were involved in plural marriage, but all women in the territory. The illogic of removing the right to vote from non-LDS Utah women drew national suffragists to the defense of women's suffrage in the territory, and LDS women worked with them as a team to reinstate women's suffrage in Utah. The personal and organizational relationship that developed proved to be a crucial connection in the years that followed. The Women's Exponent remained one of the most consistent and dependable journalistic advocates of the civil rights for women. It was always more than an inanimate record. It was a major voice, a viable advocate, illuminating the issues and participating in the debate. 6 years after the demise of the paper in 1914, Emmeline Wells, now 92, celebrated with Utah the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, extending the vote to all women in the country. As Zena D. H. Young noted in the first General Relief Society conference in 1889, the exponent had always stood ready to advocate the woman's side of all vexed questions, and Editor Wells had later noted that the goal of the paper was not just to report, but to discuss all issues that impacted women's lives, especially suffrage, education, marriage, and other points of debate included in the women question. Indeed, by the strength of their own convictions, the editors had made their little paper an indispensable women's advocate during a volatile time in LDS women's history. After the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, the movement's promise that suffrage would energize the power and unity of women, so evident during the long suffrage campaign, failed to materialize. Women did not exhibit the strength of their political power by voting as a bloc, or by voting at all. The editorial response to this dilemma was inherent in the questions the exponent asked of its readers in a similar scenario after Utah women were initially given the vote. Quote, "Women of Utah, do you reflect upon these things? Do you appreciate the blessings of the ballot? If you do, why do you not manifest it by your works?" End quote. But women expressed their individuality by voting for their own choice of candidates, and the power of female unity did not appear at the ballot box. The New Woman. Of even more value and significance was the women's exponent's part in defining the new woman emerging from the 19th century. "This is woman's era," Emmeline Wells was fond of saying. and the Woman's Exponent helped to describe the slow metamorphosis from woman on a pedestal to a real woman, Wells' preferred term. One of her favorite contemporary writers, Sarah Grand, was among those who introduced the term, which was popularized in the novels of Henry James, the plays of Henrik Ibsen, and the works of other writers. According to historian Ruth Borden, quote, "The term New Woman always referred to women who exercised control over their own lives, be it personal, social, or economic." End quote. Independence was a key virtue. With greater educational and employment opportunities now available to women, the new woman was largely independent of men as providers and protectors. The new woman found a strong voice in the Woman's Exponent. Editor Wells was pleased with the proliferation of women's clubs and organizations designed around women's interests. She herself organized 2 writing clubs, conceived to encourage women to write about their views on any subject, and she published many of their papers. She lauded the woman who had broken the chains of banning them from pursuing careers in medicine, law, education, business, journalism, and even politics and public affairs, noting that Utah was ahead of the rest of the nation in offering such opportunities to women. The Exponent happily joined the growing number of women's papers which Wells felt were essential features of the progressive elements of the 19th century. By addressing thousands of readers across the country, they could forward the work of reformation as well as record it. The Exponent was strongly committed to engaging in that march of progress. In asserting their own voices in public pursuits traditionally dominated by men, women were expressing the full impact of their emancipation from tradition-bound gender expectations and creating this new image of womanhood. Their newly heard voices affirmed the validity of their own experiences as well as their right to offer commentary on social practices and political policies. As the editor of the Exponent during the height of this transition in women's status, Emmeline Wells built on the arguments raised by her editorial predecessor on women's equality. Even before becoming editor, Wells had used the pseudonym Blanche Beechwood for several articles on women's status in marriage. She was bold in her assessments. In the past, Wells affirmed, women have been what men have made them. Men had defined the parameters of women's character, their nature, their abilities, their sphere of action, and their mission in life, she asserted. If men were so much more superior to women, she added, let them show themselves so. Real women desire someone worthy of the reverence men seem to expect. Sadly, she concluded, man with all his boasted knowledge and practical skill in reading character is still in comparative ignorance of how women feel or what they are. Too often, the editorial mused, men treat their wives as toys to be picked up and cast aside at will, very well for pastime playthings or for housekeepers, but to consider them real, genuine, rational beings is a novel idea. Many men consider women as vain, frivolous, fickle, and deceitful, incapable of performing any important part in life creditably. In many marriages, Wells commented a few years later, the wife gave all, that she may sit by his hearth, bear his children, preside at his table, and merge her life into his, to the extinguishing and crushing out of all desires, ambitions, tastes, or capabilities for anything save what he deems proper or right. She was particularly concerned about the financial arrangements in marriages, even more so when she was later unexpectedly left to provide her own living. She often editorialized on the subject and felt that financial dependence deprived a woman of personal independence. She disdained those marriages in which the husband retained to himself all knowledge of the family's financial affairs, leaving the family vulnerable to such unexpected changes in fortune as Wells would experience for herself. Not only that, she affirmed, but there would be no real partnership in marriage if one of the partners was uninformed about the financial basis of the family. The new woman, independent, educated, and financially astute, could use those attributes to enhance family life. Whatever efforts women can make, whatever she may do that is not detrimental to home life, Wells believed, that she should be permitted to do, without ridicule and without censure. In other words, she wrote, why could marriage not be a partnership, with each partner according to the other all the freedom of thought, feeling, and expression they would grant to one who was not bound to them by indissoluble ties? This was the ideal, she felt, of a woman not losing, but finding outlets for her capabilities, not only in a community setting, but at home in the family. Though the Exponent spoke primarily to adult women, Wells occasionally addressed articles to her younger readers, hoping to raise their consciences and thus broaden or modify their expectations. She appealed to them to mature intellectually as they matured physically. In an 1874 article, written under a pseudonym, she chided them for their slavish imitation of faddish fashions and worldly ways. Quote, where there is an unconstrained, natural young lady whose whole soul is not wrapped up in fashion, dress, and style, who has independence of character enough to think for herself, who is not feverishly impatient with a desire to know who her future husband will be and whether his wealth will be immense, who is contented with her lot and cheerful, joyous, and happy, people wonder why she is not like the rest. End quote. To her older readers, she had much to say about strong-minded women, a pejorative term when used by opponents of change, but valued by women who were movers and partakers of the ideals of the new woman. Editor Wells knew that many of her LDS contemporaries were suspicious of the new term and used it derogatorily. But Wells declared that she had a strong-minded mother who raised her brood of 10 children largely on her own and discovered the inadequacies of a woman without a provider. Wells was emboldened by strong-minded women of all ages. Such women, she discovered, were sure of their own convictions while cultivating self-reliance, intellectuality, personal integrity, self-respect, and competence. The true woman of the Victorian ethos, demure, passive, and compliant, was giving way to the new woman of the post-Victorian period in American society. This transition of the meaning of womanhood as articulated by the Exponent's editorials was bolstered by a host of changes in what was considered women's sphere. In Utah, the pioneering effort upset traditional divisions of labor in cultivating home life and in building communities, redefining the dimensions of spheres. Women were among the first faculty and the first student bodies in Utah's growing chain of higher education institutions. Elizabeth Kane visited Utah with her husband, Colonel Thomas L. Kane, in 1873, and she observed, after traveling through the territory, that Utahns were, quote, thousands of years behind us in some of their customs, like polygamy. In others, you would think these people the most forward children of the age. They close no career on a woman in Utah by which she can earn a living. End quote. In Utah, financial independence was a major step toward personal independence. Finally, Wells shared her thoughts about women who felt their usefulness had ended when the nest had emptied. Quote, It is the opinion of many who are wise and learned that women's mission upon the earth is maternity, with its accompanying cares and anxieties and needful exigencies, that these fill the measure of her creation, and when it is done, she should retire from the sphere of active life and gracefully welcome old age. That motherhood brings into a woman's life a richness, zest, and tone that nothing else ever can, I gladly grant you, but that her usefulness ends there, or that she has no other individual interests to serve, I cannot so readily concede." End quote. Still presiding as General Relief Society president at age 92, she demonstrated another option for older women. Thus, the women's exponents answer to those who stood guard at the border of distinct spheres of life for women and men was to announce in its editorials that this was indeed women's era, and barriers to the progress of women were slowly falling. "Let them, women," Wells proclaimed, "have the same opportunities as men for an education, observation, and experience in public and private for a succession of years, and then see if she is not equally endowed with man and prepared to bear her part on all general questions socially, politically, industrially, and educationally, as well as spiritually." This was the goal of the women's movement, and it laid the foundation for producing the new woman. The woman's exponent was a strong advocate of this new image of womanhood, far removed from the delicate, dependent qualities of the former woman on a pedestal. Gradually fading as a popular image of women, the woman on a pedestal gave way to new social forces that unlocked women's latent capabilities and created a place for them more useful than a pedestal in the great work of the world, which can never be done well by one half of the human family.
About the author. Carol Cornwall Madsen, Professor Emerita of BYU, received her PhD in history at the University of Utah and was employed by the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute of Latter-day Saint History in the Church History Department. When the institute moved to BYU, she served as associate head of the Women's Research Institute for 2 years and on several university committees, including the annual Women's Conference. She also originated a course entitled Women and the American Experience, which she taught for many years. She has authored or edited 5 books and more than 50 articles on Utah and Latter-day Saint women's history. 5 of her articles and 2 of her books have been award winners. This is an audio production of BYU Studies, read for you by Elizabeth Roberts and Susanna Pizoyan. BYU Studies publishes scholarship informed by the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. For more information and access to articles, essays, and more, visit byustudies.byu.edu.